Good day, everyone. My name is David Williams, Executive Director of the United States Association for Energy Economics. It gives me great pleasure to welcome you to today's webinar entitled Energy Policy Under the Biden Administration. We are grateful to our moderator, Dr. James Sweeney from Stanford University, and our distinguished panelists for today's timely discussion. We are also grateful to the Business Committee of the United States Association for Energy Economics, headed by Marie Fagan, for sponsoring today's webinar. First, a little bit about the United States Association for Energy Economics. We are the largest affiliate of the International Association for Energy Economics and provide a forum for the exchange of ideas, experience, and issues among professionals interested in the field. The organization produces 2 professional journals, a newsletter, and holds conferences and virtual presentations, along with a host of other products and services that you can see at our website, www.usaee.org. If you're not already a member of the association, we welcome you to join. A few housekeeping matters in regard to today's webinar before I hand things over to our moderator. First, this webinar is being recorded so that those that cannot attend today's live event may view this on our Rewind station later this afternoon. If you have any questions for our panelists, please use Zoom's Q&A feature at the bottom of your Zoom window to post your question. We've allocated sufficient time at the end of this webinar to address your questions. And now it's my pleasure to introduce you to our moderator, Dr. James Sweeney, Professor of Management, Science, and Engineering at Stanford University. Jim, over to you.
Thank you, Dave. Welcome to this webinar. I look very forward to it. We have a great, very fine panel. The goal of the webinar will be to discuss what are likely to be politically and economically feasible options given the new administration but an old Congress. The goal is not to predict which of Joseph Biden's stated goals will be finally adopted by the new administration, nor to discuss what we personally would like as goals. We each have opinions on that, but that's not what we're talking about. Our goal is to give a realistic assessment of what may actually be possible, given that there will be at most 50 Democrats in the Senate, and thus the Biden team cannot necessarily count on Senate support.
Protected at the front door.
Cannot count on so much for background noise. And thus the Biden team cannot necessarily count on Senate support, even if they win both Georgia Senate seats. Under the Biden administration, climate and energy policy are likely to be fully intertwined, and this webinar will reflect that intertwining. Each panelist has 3 to 4 minutes for initial comments. We'll follow with a round of questions for the panelists, then move to less structured follow-up with questions raised by the 4 panelists, intermixed with audience questions posed through the Q&A function online. We start with Phil Sharp. Phil, you're on.
Well, thank you, Jim. I'm delighted to be here, and let me, in these brief remarks, just make several major assertions, which some may want to debate and others may just find terribly obvious. But I think it's very important to recognize that there have been major developments in our economy and our politics over the last several years that actually portend very favorable action by the federal government on climate policy. And let me just quickly tick off a few. Obviously, any number of states have already undertaken policies to cut emissions or to advance clean technologies. They, in addition, a number of them now have made major claims and commitments to decarbonization. When we look at the marketplace, we also obviously see a host of new economic entrants who are advancing solar energy, advancing a whole host of technologies. And here again, we have major corporations in literally every sector of the economy, including oil, who are making not only cuts in emissions, but are actually making claims that they will do dramatic cuts over the next few years. And in many cases, they need public policy to help them accomplish anything close to what their goals are. On the international scene, of course, our markets are now very much influenced by what's happening in international markets and what foreign policies are being taken up in Europe, China, and elsewhere. Obviously, solar costs are way down in America because of Spain, China, Germany, and China's a huge investment kind of things. Electric vehicles are being pushed in almost all these major markets. China is saying that they're going to start the whole industry in clean air conditioning to be sold around the world. The point being, there are now economic interests that are very much engaged on this issue and will be engaged in the politics. That doesn't mean they'll all agree. Turning very quickly to the new president, obviously his campaign has made ambitious advocacy. His new appointments have clearly got this as a strong agenda item. And I think what we can really expect is not only early action on Paris, which is important, but minor compared to the recharging of all the regulatory processes on cars, on power plants, on methane emissions, et cetera. In other words, they're not going to wait for Congress to act, in my opinion. Now, what we don't know is whether the new court will be more difficult to get some of these regulations passed. If we turn quickly to Congress, as Jim already said, the outcome of the Georgia election may tell us just how strong we can get actions out of Congress on this issue. But I think it's important to recognize climate is going to arise in the legislative process on virtually all major issues. So it's going to ride on the backs of infrastructure, stimulus, tax reform, appropriations, kind of thing. And it's going to come up under banners other than climate. It's going to come up on banners of creating jobs, of facing international competition, of getting America technologically advanced kind of proposition. I think this portends that we're going to actually begin to see a cross-party coalition supporting any number of select issues. This was already happening in the past Congress when on the tax, the tax credit 45Q, for example, and advanced nuclear research. But I think it seems unlikely, depending on the outcome of that Georgia election, that the Congress will see any grand package of bipartisan leadership on the team to advance anything that restricts emissions like a clean energy standard in the electric sector. May come about, possibly there's one route that I can imagine it might. So I think that the reality is going to be ahead of us is that at every step of the way, significant or insignificant on policy decisions, advocates for climate change are going to be aggressively pursuing efforts to bargain for something on climate.
Thank you. Second, John Jimison.
Thank you very much, Jim, and it's a pleasure to be honored by being included in this panel. I fully agree with Phil that there's a lot of momentum internationally, domestically, among states and municipalities toward work on a clean energy transition and dealing with the climate crisis. The question I think before us is, will the federal government be able to join that momentum, or will there still be blockages to it? I'm going to focus on two policy areas, one of which I think the Biden administration can make great progress on without having to get a lot of support from Congress, and that's energy efficiency. And the other of which, energy infrastructure, I think will not be possible unless the Congress, and particularly the Republicans in Congress, agree that this is kind of an investment the federal government needs to be deeply involved in. In terms of energy efficiency, there's a lot that can be done with regulation and has been done with regulation, setting new efficiency standards and implementing efficiency practices through the federal government and elsewhere. The Trump administration backed off on higher standards for motor vehicles through CAFE, on light bulbs, and on other things. The Biden administration can reverse many of those and move towards higher standards and restoring, in terms of energy efficiency, what I think most analysts agree is the largest, cheapest, quickest, least technology dependent means of reducing carbon pollution and getting more productivity from existing energy sources. Higher appliance standards can be set under existing law, both for consumer appliances and for a range of industrial equipment. And higher efficiency standards can be set for buildings as well with energy efficiency building codes. The energy efficiency programs don't take a lot of taxpayer money and therefore shouldn't need to be fought in Congress or in the courts. On energy infrastructure, I suspect that it's a different set story because there's a lot of money involved in investment in energy infrastructure. The Trump administration promised an infrastructure bill, never delivered one, despite no opposition, simply because you couldn't figure out how to pay for it. And I think Republicans are going to quickly take the position, as was suggested earlier, that the federal deficit is already too great to make major investments. And not only that, the Democrats are committed to doing COVID relief, and that will use a lot of what flexibility there might be in the federal budget. Nonetheless, there are major energy-related infrastructure projects that could be bipartisan. An expanded, integrated, modernized electricity grid that could deliver clean energy from red states to offset carbon emissions in blue states, that could motivate and accelerate transition to electrification of the transportation sector. On the other hand, natural gas infrastructure has become very controversial over recent years. And that's one where I don't think the Congress and the administration are likely to have an easy agreement. So energy efficiency, thumbs up. Energy infrastructure, don't think we're going to be going too fast. And now I'll turn it back over to Jim and to Sue and Joe, who know a lot about those things.
I'm turning this over very quickly to Sue Tierney.
Hi, everybody. I've been asked to talk about oil and gas and research and development in 3 minutes. So first, on oil and gas, I'm going to mention 5 things that I would be looking to see happen under a Biden administration. First, on emissions, I would expect EPA to roll back on methane emissions controls. Number 2, at the Department of Interior, I would expect public lands and leasing for development of oil and gas to be more limited than we've seen, certainly in the last 4 years, and perhaps even prior to that, where there had been leasing of federal lands for development. Number 3, at FERC, and it's a little intimidating looking at Mr. Keller here right now as I'm about to say this, I would expect that when there is a majority of Democrats on the commission, that we would see pipeline certification become transition to having more scrutiny over need for new pipes, as well as examination of the greenhouse gas emissions associated with the gas that is carried by the pipelines. Number 5, for power plants that use natural gas or any other fossil fuel, I would expect EPA to tighten up the 111B new source review standards as a way to address and think about any limits on new power plants that are fossil and that do not have controls for carbon emissions in the future. And then finally, still on oil and gas, I would expect for emissions of vehicles that EPA will be friendly to California's waiver on the vehicle standards. Now, finally, just on R&D, I would expect that this is one area where there could be bipartisan support in Congress for a package of R&D programs that look at clean generation, especially advanced power generation technologies, advanced nuclear, carbon capture and storage, hydrogen, and so forth. And I would expect to see long duration storage be a piece of that R&D package. So DOE would be the administrator of those grant programs, of course, but I would expect to see that's one area where Congress could issue new authorities or new funding. So back to you, Jim.
Well, and thank you. And directly back to Joe Kelleher.
Great, thanks, Jim. And I do want to pick up on Sue's comment about gas pipelines and what could the next chairman do, but maybe we can address that in Q&A. I want to focus my remarks on the Biden Clean Energy Plan as it applies to the electricity sector. And I do think under the Biden administration, energy and environmental policy will be inseparable. They will be unified. mean, in other administrations, they're generally considered different domains, charged to different agencies, and even different congressional committees. But I think under the Biden administration, they will be unified. They're the same thing. I think it's interesting that President-elect Biden has identified climate change as one of its top 4 immediate priorities. It's the one non-discretionary priority of the 4. The other 3 are kind of forced on him by events such as economic recovery. But if you look at the Biden Clean Energy Plan, the goals are very aggressive. At least they're aggressive, particularly when it comes to the electricity sector, a carbon-free electricity sector by 2035. Now, if you want to get a handle on whether that's in the world of the possible, I think it's helpful to look back 20 years. And you look at how the US electricity supply has changed in the last 20 years. It's been the most dynamic, most rapid change in our electricity supply in the 100+ year history of the industry. We went from coal being 51% of our supply to 23, gas went from 17 to 38, and wind and solar went from under 2 to 11. But focus on the hydro components, the fossil components. Fossil went from 68% of our electricity supply during this period of tremendously dramatic change to 61% of our electricity supply. The coal and gas components, of course, changed, but the notion of going from 61% of our electricity supply coming from fossil to 0 in 15 years seems implausible, or hopeful. It creates to me, the biggest variables are, do we have technological breakthroughs in both storage and gas CCS near term, not in year 14, not in 2034, but fairly soon? And do we actually have really significant market reforms, both wholesale and retail market reforms, particularly to encourage more broader demand response? We need correct storage pricing. We need higher price caps in the wholesale markets in order to encourage the investment in non-renewable resources that we need to balance renewables. Now, Phil has commented on what's in the world of the possible legislative. If you look at how does policy and law change? It really changes 3 ways. It changes by Congress, it changes by agency action reinterpreting existing law, and it actually changes through the courts. The courts sometimes find that agencies have more authority than they thought. Look at the Massachusetts decision where the Supreme Court told EPA it actually could regulate carbon. So I think there is potential for legislative action. Energy policy tends to be bipartisan or nonpartisan. Unfortunately, environmental policy tends to be hopelessly partisan. So I'm not as optimistic about legislation that's purely environmental. But I think there's opportunities for significant energy legislation. And there's some Republican support, very strong leadership on important components of the Biden plan. I think parts of it, federal procurement, federal R&D, transmission and tax provisions, are all achievable legislatively. They're at least in the world of the possible. I think the CES, the Clean Energy Standard, is a much less likely outcome. So I think I will leave my remarks there and look forward to Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you all, and you all did keep it to the very short comments that we suggest. I'd like to start with Paris. I think we all expect that on day 1 or close to day 1, United States will announce that it will rejoin the Paris Agreement. How much will that matter? Will it really matter either domestically or internationally? Let me turn first to Phil on this, but others may have some comments.
Well, it's so anticipated that perhaps it's baked into investors and everybody else's thinking, but I think it clearly reinforces the direction that the United States is going to go and try to become an international leader again. The hard thing for the administration is they've got to come up with a new pledge plan for the next pledging period. And that will necessarily entail assumptions about what they hope to accomplish on the regulatory front or through the legislature to be able to actually show real progress in their claim. But you want to remember, whatever we submit as a plan is just a plan which we say we'll try to keep up with, and there's no penalty involved in this. There's been a lot of, because of Trump's distortion of what the agreement was to begin with, there's a lot of misunderstanding that it doesn't actually require anything other than that we submit a plan and try to make an effort to do it. So I think it's relevant. But what it's going to partly drive with Kerry out front is that pressure is going to be pushed by him and others back into the domestic politics. It's going to keep it at the forefront. It's just one more piece. It's not the driving force.
Jim,
Yeah, Sue.
yeah, let me just add to that. I agree with what Phil said and think that it's very important for international leadership and the U.S. There's a lot of countries that would like to see the U.S. restored to that position. I think the key thing over time will be, after we rejoin the Paris Agreement, the key thing will be what happens in terms of how much progress we are making on that plan. And we've all just said that we don't expect Congress to do a lot immediately on things that would directly reduce greenhouse gas emissions from the economy. But there is so much happening today already, as each one of the my colleagues has said. When you add up the footprint, the geographic footprint of the electric utilities that have made carbon commitments to be zero emitting over the next few decades, and you add to that the states that have a policy to do that, and you add to that corporate and cities and counties and academic campuses and so forth, you really end up covering quite a large part of the economy. So that I think it will be key to be able to demonstrate internationally that those things count. And that's in addition to whatever regulatory actions will take place and be enduring through court challenges over time. I'm still not assuming there's going to be bipartisan support for a clean energy standard anytime soon.
And this, following up on what Sue said, for some time now, the impetus for real energy and climate policy has come from cities and states, subnational entities, and with the federal government resisting. And I hear Sue saying that's still going to be happening. Maybe not the resistance, but the attention coming from federal and state is going into a Biden administration. Will this amplify the interest of states and federal to be creative in the way that they're doing now? Would anybody like to comment on that possibility?
I'll make a comment. I regret that Congress didn't pass the Bingaman bill from 2009 to 2010. I thought that was that was a really important piece of legislation. It was sort of the opposite of the Waxman-Markey bill. Waxman-Markey laid out a goal, and then it had a very controversial cap and trade scheme to achieve that goal. But the goal was very controversial because you could characterize it as imposing a burden of shooting ourselves in the foot, hurting our economy. Whereas the bill, it implemented the means to achieve an unstated goal. But I just think that's politically much more achievable to do things like the significant efficiency investments that we want to make and appliance standards. It did have a renewable energy standard in it, which if we probably looked at, I think it was like 15% or something. If you looked at it now, it seemed very quaint probably. But I think something like the Bingaman bill, that structure has more of a chance because it focuses on the means to an end, not the end, which could be mischaracterized or made controversial.
And John, either John or Phil, this seems to be an area that you may feel comfortable commenting on. John, do you want to Phil?
No, I'm happy to agree with Joe that to adopt means to an end is often more practical than to adopt an end and then look for the means. And I think there are a lot of means with which there ought to be congressional bipartisan support if they don't involve money and if they don't involve a lot of strong arm tactics, which I think will be sensitive points. But I
You
used
know,
to work for
what-
Phil, and I still do intellectually. So Phil, you take this on.
No, I work for you. I do think one of the things that has changed in the way in which the public debate has gone that is significant, and it's quite the opposite of what both Joe and John were saying is achievable, which I would fully agree with them that approach is, but it's almost become the reverse in terms of the advocacy community of setting a big goal. And of course, that's what, as Joe pointed out, the campaign did. Now, I think it's always been questionable whether you can really let the goal drive the policy or whether it's just an aspirational kind of proposition. So that adds, I think, to a bit of a complication to doing something like Joe said, a CES standard that is more acceptable, because then I'm not sure how much the left is going to oppose it. But apart from that, let me suggest a different, not necessarily different, but add that another possible path for CES in the Congress would be if EPA is trying to regulate it something akin to the CPP, the old Clean Power Plan, and the electric utility industry actually could come together in significant numbers and say, you know what, we could support an alternative legislative that might generate enough bipartisanship, and it might keep at bay the people that would want to filibuster and whatnot. These are only mights, but they are possible things in which industry actually might be able to have an influence over the outcome.
And as moderator, let me just one quick summary of a quote that I think summarizes how I think about this. And that is, a goal without a plan is merely a wish. And I personally love when Jeff Bingaman was, as senator, was pushing for the foot in the door with a clean, with renewable, a clean energy portfolio. Once you learn how to do things, you develop and you get better and better, and that number goes up as you learn.
Right.
And I, as a Californian, get very frustrated that we set massive goals without always thinking about how to get there. Anyway, any more on this issue?
Yeah, Jim, let me just add, when I hear people talking about a clean energy standard and whether the national government will adopt one, I really hear two themes in what people are saying. On the one hand, there's a long thread in the economics literature and certainly in the discussions of many participants that a clean energy standard is like a cap and trade standard. It is a tradable emissions standard on how much greenhouse gas can be emitted per megawatt hour. And on the other hand, I hear a clean energy standard as a word that applies to something that's more like a renewable portfolio standard, but is agnostic with regard to what zero emission technology will be moved into the market by an increasing percentage of load serving entities' sales to their customers. And I think the latter is more like what Bingaman's bill was like. And I think that has much more chance than the former. But I hear people just saying a CES, and I never know which one they're talking about at the moment. So I think there's some, I would love to see a little bit more discipline about what people mean when they say that. And I really do hope that there could be some kind of approach like the Bingaman bill that could move forward. I think there's some support for that.
Let me then shift this slightly based upon this theme. We've seen a group of energy policies that really look like that create markets, but don't look like they create markets. The ability for in the CAFE standards for trading the attributes in the car. China is setting up a carbon. It's not quite cap and trade system. It is a performance standard for utilities that can be traded between utilities. The clean energy standard, as Sue talked about, was a tradable thing. Many economists talk about cap either cap and trade or carbon tax as a way of getting in markets. But we found other ways of sneaking in markets in the back door. Do any of you see good ideas that are likely to come into being of creating market-like mechanisms, including the cap and trade? I'd like to start with the two people who've been closest to Congress on this, either Phil or John. What do we see about these market-like mechanisms?
Let me quickly say, you were talking about the grand plan for the economy-wide, if you're talking about a carbon tax or most cap and trade systems.
Yes.
I think that's going to be a difficult lift. But what you know is it's not a new idea, it's an old one that it allows trading. And trading at least has a very important market component, which I hope and believe should be in all regulatory systems. Now, one thing that's happening again in the public debate is, especially among the environmental justice community, which is much more politically active and in the democratic circles, is a high skepticism of that. And some of it's legitimate because you can end up with what they call hotspots, but that's not the case with most carbon dioxide restrictions. But I do think that that's a place that we should strongly focus on in discussions, both on Capitol Hill and in the regulatory process of trying to capitalize that. Because as everybody knows here, we have got to get private investors and consumers and things more fully engaged, or this is not going to happen. The policy has got to help make that happen.
And Jim, the only thing that I would add to that, that I think, probably most of our participants understand, carbon dioxide is the ultimate externality. There's no way that an actual economic market would buy and sell that, because anybody just by breathing emits it. So it takes a government role. It takes a government plan. It can be tax-based. It can be a pseudo market like cap and trade. And it can be a standard that's set that is then enforced by government. But we can't avoid dealing with government to do it nationally. And we can't avoid dealing with international agreements to do it internationally.
Other comments in this area? You brought up the issue, Sue.
Mr. Chairman, and that's not Chairman Phil Sharp of the committee. I'm talking about Mr. Chairman from the FERC. I think that there, that's right. I think that there could be interesting opportunities under a Biden administration FERC to have carbon pricing enter into the regional markets. We've certainly seen development of that idea in the New York ISO footprint. There's a lot of interest in PJM states, especially among those states that have carbon commitments already on their books. So I think that that would be an interesting place where we could see a pricing mechanism. And depending upon how it's structured, such as the way that the New York ISO proposal is designed, there are crediting mechanisms to address the ability of consumers to see the price in real time, but then get a credit back during the settlement process. So I think that that's an area where there could be some opportunity as well. But Mr. Chairman, what do you think?
Yeah, no, I think FERC has authority to approve that, and we've always looked to New York, right? New York. I thought New York would have actually maybe filed it earlier because their clean energy standard, I thought, was not legally sustainable. I didn't think the New York Commission, looking at its organic, actually had the authority to approve it, but the courts disagreed with me. So I thought that was a plan B for if their clean energy standard failed, then they would go with carbon pricing. And I thought their clean energy standard would be overturned by the state courts, not the federal courts, and that then they would have submitted carbon pricing. And I think FERC would have approved it. It's harder in a multi-state region where there's disagreement on either is there a merit to a carbon fee or what should the fee be? It's harder. It's not impossible, but it's harder. And I think that certainly can happen. And I think it will happen. It's just a question of when.
Yeah, I think just in New York, there was such momentum coming out of the new law, the climate bill that New York passed, and then COVID struck. And so that diverted, let's just say that diverted a little attention of the administration for a while. But I would still be hopeful that that would come to FERC as a proposal.
Yeah, I think so. It'd be easier if a region or an RTO submits it, rather than the hardest situation for FERC would be if one state in a multi-state region filed a complaint saying, my other states aren't saving the planet as much as I am. And FERC, I want you to impose a carbon fee on every state in the region, and good luck coming up with a number. That would be extremely uncomfortable for FERC to act on.
I've heard one of the, oh, sorry, Jim. Go ahead.
No, go ahead, Sue. I'll be next.
I was just going to say that I've heard a senior economist at PJM mention that he thought the New York model could be implemented in a way, on the footprint of a state with a carbon approach, so that you could see that hybrid design going on. But I agree with you; it's definitely harder.
Yeah.
Let's bring this back a moment. In the Obama administration, the concept of a social cost of carbon was formalized through the use of a few models. There's some questions about what the number really should be, but it was formalized. Then the concept was pretty much gutted under the Trump administration. Do we see the possibility of the social cost of carbon number being adopted through, say, OMB at a national level in a way that could be implemented in regulation, in the regulatory policy or the benefit cost analysis that is done in regulation, in FERC rulings on pricing of electricity or interstate commerce, on energy efficiency rules, and even infrastructure development? Do we see that concept as being an important thing that may come through this administration and be a driving force under the surface for all of these different changes? Would like to take that on.
I'll start. I mean, it's something certainly the administration could do, but when it comes to independent agencies, the independent agencies don't feel that they're bound by executive orders. So if CEQ or OMB said social cost of carbon is X, that doesn't bind FERC at all. So you would end up, and even if let's pretend it did bind FERC, or FERC chose to be bound, which would require really the majority of the commissioners agreeing, you would end up litigating that number. And it probably would be in its first concrete application, because if OMB or CEQ said there is a social cost of carbon and it's X, that by itself, that decision you really couldn't bring to court. It would be in its first application. And what's the outcome there? I don't know. So it's something that could happen, but it doesn't necessarily bind certainly the independent agencies. And then you have to assess what's the relative role of FERC versus the executive branch agencies, which would be bound by an executive order to that social cost of carbon. It would apply to a lot of agencies like, BLM, Fish and Wildlife Service. A lot of agencies that have a huge role that are not frequently considered as environmental agencies would be bound by that kind of OMB or CEQ social cost of carbon decision.
And I don't think there's any doubt that they will try to resurrect one exists under the Trump administration, but it's very low. But they'll try to drive that number up, which as you already know, and maybe the audience doesn't know, is a part of the regulatory analysis required whenever you make a rule that might affect the issue anywhere throughout, except in the independent agencies, as Joe pointed out.
Yeah, I would expect that this might be a place where FERC, a Biden administration appointed chairman of FERC, might lead a Democratic majority to incorporate a social cost of carbon as part of a pipeline certification review process. I mean, there are definitely tea leaves in dissents that would suggest that Commissioner Glick, were he to be chair or a member of a majority, would move in that direction. It would involve a lot of changes in the actual templates of reviews of pipelines. But I wouldn't be surprised to see things move in that direction.
John, do you want to comment on this in the regulatory impact analyses applied to energy efficiency?
Well, yeah, I think the social cost of carbon would be a unifying economic threshold that, despite the disputes that would arise in different agencies and independent agencies, could be seen across the government and across all fields as a way of putting the entire potential impact of climate change into our analysis. I think the soft underbelly of a social cost of carbon is how badly how poor we are at anticipating the net present cost of climate change in the decades from now, when it's really going to be hitting us so hard. You know, how do you put a price now on the loss of coastal cities to sea level rise? And what is that price? And what do you need to pay now to deal with it? That's what is so hard to build into a social cost of carbon. But I think it would be a healthy exercise for us to try to do that, and to try to have an understanding now of what that future cost has to be, so that we can be planning against it.
And it would be a full employment act for energy economists. So come on.
Well, I think it is important to realize that the choice of the social cost of carbon is really a major policy choice. And it's not just an intellectual modeling proposition. That's very important, and you try to bring a lot of expertise to bear, but it's so loaded with assumptions that are not actually, I think, provable in today's world, that you're really making a choice of the significance of trying to drive your regulatory process. And I think the Biden OIRA will simply make a much stronger one. Now, whether it will get challenged at various points in the court. So there has to be some intellectual basis for it, but it really is how to drive the policy throughout the executive branch.
And in that sense, it doesn't have to be the right number counting for everything, a number that's high enough to drive policy that misses some of the other impacts can be very powerful, even though people will argue that it could be higher if you did better continued science, and it can be adjusted. At least that's my view, but I'm just a moderator. I'm not.
Well, I'm guessing too. Go ahead.
It really would just have to be some number that has some decent basis. It's not arbitrary and capricious. And then you'd have to explain why the contrary view, with presumably much lower numbers, why you didn't put enough weight, you didn't put much weight on it. It's definitely, it is winnable, I think.
John, I saw a movement there. Did you have more additional comment? No. Okay. There's several questions that have come up on the infrastructure, and I'd like to discontinuously change to some of those things. Is there strong support for, at the federal level, expanding the grid that allows both expanding and enhancing and bringing a smarter grid that allows renewables to much more effectively be brought in and traded over a longer period of time? Is this the sort of infrastructure that is possible, or as John suggested, that infrastructure could be difficult to develop because of congressional opposition? Would anybody like to comment on these infrastructure issues? And I turn it to either Joe or John, whichever of you like to go first.
I mean, I'm happy to go first or second. I think I think there is a need for significant investment in the grid, because if you look at what is the transmission grid, it was developed in the past for yesterday's electricity supply, to deliver yesterday's electricity supply. As the electricity supply is changing dramatically, we need a very different grid. I actually don't really think there's legislation necessary to achieve that. I do think regional planning has, I'm not sure I'd say fail, but I'd say a C-, which I guess is the modern F. So I give it a C- in that it's very short term. It inherently relies very much on interconnection upgrades. So it builds out the grid in the most inefficient way possible. And so I don't give the RTOs very high marks on regional planning. And it can change. The reason why I think it's working so poorly at the RTO level is the threat of competition. Incumbents don't like competition. They'd be happy to massively increase their investment in the grid if they didn't have to worry about competing for the right to spend X billion dollars on transmission. If they were preserved from that, if they were safeguarded from that competition, they'd make the investment, I think, more readily, and you rely less on interconnection upgrades. You could build more proactively, more long-term, but it probably would end up being at a higher cost. So you really have to come down to what's more important to jumpstart investment, to have large-scale investment relatively soon, or to police excessive costs in building out the grid, and that's a choice.
I think that when the courts affirmed FERC's Order 1000 on regional planning, FERC tiptoed up to but stopped short of requiring interregional planning. And it's nothing in that affirmance that suggests to me FERC wouldn't have the authority to create essentially a national RTO to help the regions plan interregional capacity and help demonstrate what studies have shown from NREL and others, the enormous benefit to cost ratio one would get for the US to join most of the other advanced countries in the world in having a truly national grid. And I think there's a major role for the federal government to play, because the big opposition to the expansion of the grid is the aesthetic intrusion and the land use issues and the land ownership issues that make it very difficult for someone to want a transmission grid to be within their viewscape or over their land. The federal government owns or can basically use major corridors from interstate highways, and railroads already are planning and looking at the possibility of using their corridors for transmission. I think there's a lot of potential for the expansion of the grid in such corridors and the integration of the grid. And I think it ties directly to dealing with the range anxiety issues that are preventing a lot of electrification of motor vehicles, trucks, and cars, because you don't want to drive beyond the range of your battery without a place to recharge. You could have recharging stations all across the country tied to that kind of a grid. But this is not a near-term achievement. This is the kind of thing that if we could do it in 10 years, could make a big difference in whether we can get to a clean energy economy in 2035.
Sue?
Can I, oh.
Sure,
Sue,
yeah, go ahead. No, Joe, go ahead.
Just one brief comment. John mentioned interregional transmission, and I'm going to be Monday night quarterback on a friend's Order 1000, John Wellinghoff. I think Order 1000 was a really important accomplishment. But I do think, in retrospect, it would have been better that Order 1000 be silent on interregional planning, but instead for ACT using its 1935 authority, it use its 206 authority, find the two RTOs that are the poster boy for poor interregional planning. And at the time, I would have said it's PJM and MISO, and use FERC's authority and proactively require them to make tariff changes. Instead of, hey, can you guys plan in the hope that projects come up that they both love and then develop? That has not, to my knowledge, produced a single interregional project. But that would have been, I think, neater, because there aren't interregional problems everywhere. There's not a need for, I don't think, for interregional transmission crisscrossing every RTO. But boy, if you started with two of the RTOs and attack that seam, you'd be sending a signal to the other RTOs that they can either voluntarily solve the problem or they'll be the subject of the next FERC 206 proceeding.
Sue?
I love that idea, Joe. That's a great idea.
The next FERC could do that. The next FERC could do that too. That doesn't have an expiration date.
That's right. I'm probably going to say something heretical here, so let me give it a shot. First, there are virtually no studies about decarbonizing the US economy that do not presume you have to build out a very large transmission grid in order to to create an opening of the market for really high quality renewables. They're not going to build if they don't have a load that they can send it to. So it's really that classic chicken and egg problem. And so let's assume that the Biden administration, which aspires to have zero carbon electricity supply by 2035. And I said it's an aspiration because that would be a big stretch to get there. But that's going to require fast action on a lot of these things, including something on transmission. So here's the heretical thing. I think an unintended consequence of something that has brought a lot of efficiency gains is the unbundling of transmission and generation planning. And an unintended consequence is that we don't have this leading transmission planning in conjunction with saying we need to open up that generation market. And so I really would hope that FERC and the administration find ways to declare transmission policy as something that is in the national interest and that we can move forward to build out a grid in conjunction with hoping that we can build out renewables. Because I don't know how we can possibly get there in terms of carbon reductions in the power sector, which is going to grow with electrification.
Bill?
Jim, let me suggest, John identified what a tough hurdle it might be to get an infrastructure bill through Congress, but let me take the other point of view and say, I think there's real opportunity there that doesn't mean it'll happen. And the reason I say that is because we're right now in a very serious economic situation. So I think you're at minimum going to have a major proposal out of the administration to, in many ways, deal with infrastructure, and might include something as simple as just directing FERC to do as Sue is talking about, that they have a responsibility for making a national plan, and they may or may not get additional authorities. But I think there are lots of things that can be done that may have, it won't be on a shovel-ready view as it was in 2009, which restricted the kinds of things you wanted to invest in. Both parties and most of the people in both parties have campaigned on this. And if you get this going, I think you have a greater difficulty of just standing in the way of it, especially if there's an economic need. And it has so many other appealing things. We're focused on a few things related to climate and energy here, but it has so much to do with the general development of the economy, our international competition and things, and it has been given a high priority. So I think there's clearly a strong argument and many political forces that will want it. Whether you can lead through it or not, I don't know.
John, you have any response?
Yeah, my view is that there is strong bipartisan support for getting infrastructure done. I think the question is who pays for it and how. And the obstacle I see in Congress is if there's a major federal investment that's required to do it on, say, the interstate highway model or something of that sort. I just think that's going to be seen as a bridge too far for people who are concerned about the federal deficit. And the Trump administration proposal was that states would be putting up the bulk of the money, and the states didn't have the money, and that just couldn't go anywhere. There's a public-private partnership model where you give private investors the opportunity to build it, own it for a period, profit from it, make a recovery of their investment, and then turn it back over to the public sector. That model has been used by states, but there's questions about that, and the investment would have to have a reasonable payback period for investors to be using that. So I agree fully with Phil that there should be bipartisan support for the concept of it. I have trouble seeing, bipartisan plan to pay for it that seems to work.
Okay, let me turn now to some of the issues of specific technologies. A word I don't know if I've heard is nuclear power. Any thoughts about where the administration and Congress may likely to come to agreement? on letting nuclear die the death it's dying now, or change that? And I guess FERC comes in here as well. Anybody want to comment on nuclear?
Sure.
I guess
Go
I'll
ahead.
say something.
Go ahead.
And I think this one will run on maybe two parallel and potentially inconsistent paths. Most people who talk about it in an advanced R&D agenda include small nuclear reactors as part of that. And so I would expect to see an R&D package that could be bipartisan supported. That was terrible English, I apologize. Would include advanced nuclear as part of it. And there's a lot of work going in that direction. The other countervailing tension is that among the four priorities of the Biden administration that Joe pointed to early on, one of them is carbon control and the climate agenda, but the other one is equity. And the EJ community is not a fan of nuclear, in part because of uranium mine tailings on tribal lands and a number of other things. And so I think that there will be continuing debates about where this administration is going to come out on nuclear issues. But I would definitely see Congress supporting an R&D agenda that includes it.
Jim, I fully agree. I think you're going to see a very strong support for nuclear. Much of it may be behind the scenes, but when you look at the existing plants, they provide 50% of all of our clean energy now. Every time we lose one, we have another hole to make up for. And more people and more studies have all identified this as significant. And Sue's not wrong about some of the oppositions coming, but a lot of the traditional environmental movement has at least gone silent on this. And the question is how can the federal government help? A number of states have acted to preserve these plants, like Illinois and New York and New Jersey and Connecticut. But we may need some kind of federal action. I think the issue, as Sue points out, the most likely new build is going to be a push on the SMRs, the small nuclear reactors. But the long-term investment has already begun and already got bipartisan support when they authorized a major program. Now and they've actually appropriated in these last appropriations money so that out at INEL, out at the Idaho plantation, they're going to try new facilities and things. So there's a lot of support for that. And I would I put fusion in that. Now, the way it might come up in a bargain, as Sue was saying, is in the package that will also have lots of support for lots of these other kind of more acceptable to the environmental community technologies.
Can I comment? I mean,
Yes.
I agree that I find it hard to see any significant energy legislation passing. I'm talking about a big bill rather than just like an energy efficiency bill that wouldn't have some kind of nuclear title. There's just such strong support for it, reflexive. Now, it doesn't have to be part of a Biden administration proposal because it'll get added. They just have to not object. But then whatever's in that title will be irrelevant. I don't think advanced nuclear, small nuclear reactors are going to be built. Just look at the experience in Georgia and South Carolina. I can't imagine any publicly traded company pursuing a nuclear plant. Even I just don't see any utility building a nuclear plant, and I have a hard time seeing a non-utility doing it. So I think nuclear has to be part of a legislative deal. But I think it almost doesn't matter. I don't think advanced nuclear plants are going to be built. I don't even think the current new designs that are being built with difficulty in Georgia.
Joe, I don't disagree. We're talking about 2040, 2050, or what might become part of it's in part trying to create more options as we find how difficult it is to achieve, carbon-free power in this country.
Yeah. I just think
solar, I agree.
Right now you can build solar plus storage with today's storage, not tomorrow's, with much greater certainty on cost, same performance, and no risk on timetable. So why, you don't need nuclear if you
Right.
can combine big 2,000 megawatts of solar plus storage.
Yeah,
But I think it's, sorry, John, go ahead.
I was just going to say that I think Joe is right, that nobody's going to build another megawatt scale light water reactor, given the experience at the Vogtle plants and elsewhere. And that we will not build new nuclear reactors until we have a licensed new technology that is much smaller in scale, modular, and can be placed safely anywhere. So we're going to have a big window during which time our existing fleet of light water reactors are going to have to be very closely watched for vulnerability and management and operation, because we are going to depend on them for a major part of our clean energy. And they're fragile plants, and we've had major problems in the past. We have to be extremely careful to depend on them going forward. We've extended their working lives to 60 years in a number of cases, and that's a pretty heroic assumption about how long these big machines can run.
Okay.
80's the new 40 though, isn't it?
Yeah. Let me transition before we lose Sue. Sue, if you have a minute or two more, I intend to extend this a little beyond our 9 o'clock limit, because I want to get into R&D. What we've suggested in nuclear is there's going to be research and development is needed to make that viable. We see NREL has been very powerful in clean energy technology. Do people see a possibility of significant expansion of clean energy research and development coming with the Congress, or do we think all of a sudden we'll have deficit hawks come back in again now that we have a Democratic administration? We'll have Democratic hawks in Congress. Sue, would you like to comment on that? I know you're going to have to leave shortly.
Thanks, Jim, for that question. I could see R&D as part of a package that was partly the stimulus package. And by R&D, what I mean there is especially focused on what needs to happen in order to get a dispatchable 24/7 set of resources for the electric system that can be commercially viable decades from now. I don't see how we can possibly get to zero carbon electricity sector without such resources. That could be tail end equipment, again, on fossil, if it was CCUS, that could be hydrogen, that could be nuclear, but without something that really allows for a huge polar vortex of long duration, I don't think that you cannot provide 24/7 electricity supply in a cold climate or a hot climate under those kinds of extreme event conditions. So I think the R&D has to happen, has to start now, could be part of a stimulus package if we can ever get that through Congress. And with that, great to see you guys. Stay healthy.
Thank you, Sue. And I intend to extend this a little bit. So thank you, Sue. I appreciate it. Phil.
Jim, yeah, I wanted to say already, in the last 4 years, despite the theory of complete stalemate and bipartisan gridlock, we have seen a strong support for ARPA-E, which the Trump administration wanted to get through. This is the innovative part of the research design that was adopted on a bipartisan basis back in 2008. And this agency has, it's about $300 and some million that has been appropriated. And in this last year, on a bipartisan basis, in the big appropriations bill, they increased it instead of decreased it. Now, part of that has to do with the fact that it's not just exclusive or related to climate, but the fact is it's because there's broad basis view that this country is losing its technological and innovative edge and will lose it, and clearly will if it doesn't aggressively keep up. So this already has, the only question is will it, how much it be expanded, how much is it wise to expand it, but also how much it will be expanded. So that will be done within the regular appropriations bill. I'll bet you they get more money this fall already. That isn't the be all and end all. Most of research we've talked about so far are gigantic long-term propositions. This is stuff that's really highly disciplined. It is one of the most interesting creations in the federal establishment, because if your notion of bureaucracy, get it out of your head. This is not, it operates in an innovative fashion. It operates in close contact with the private sector, and it's in theory making a lot of good progress.
I mean, I agree with Phil. I personally think if you look at DOE's R&D historically, it is not very successful program, except for ARPA-E. ARPA-E is like kind of the one part of the DOE R&D program that stands out, and it was modeled in turn on a DoD model that proved to be successful. In part because there was less congressional interference, in part because decisions were less politically dictated. Merit actually had a big part of investment decisions. So yeah,
and they bring in personnel from the private sector for like a 3-year stint, and they go back to the private sector. The goal is to get people that really know their stuff and know how to get something done.
Are there other new technologies that we should be thinking about that are coming up that'll be significant? For example, and it can be little ones that allow the demand side of the market to become dispatchable, like the supply side of the market. And John, would you like to comment on any of those things, particularly on the demand side of the market?
Yeah, absolutely, Jim. And yes, indeed, there are new technologies that electric utilities are going to be able to use, so that they don't simply have to estimate demand and make sure they have the supply available to meet it, that they can, in fact, model the demand, model the supply, and have the flexibility with digital devices to assure very reliable 24/7 service to those who are fully willing to pay for it, including a suite of demand response customers who are willing not to pay for 24/7 service if they have adequate notice of being curtailed. So the demand side is going to be very much a part of this, and the autonomy of individual electricity consumers at the industrial level and even at the residential level is going to be an increasing part of having a secure system. The cybersecurity element of that becomes increasingly important, and that's something where we'll be seeing a lot of attention, and I'm sure bipartisan support for that attention as well.
And this is something that people in FERC must have paid some significance to, the cybersecurity and the demand side management. Joe, is that an area you feel comfortable commenting on?
Yeah, cyber. I mean,
no,
cyber.
It's okay.
Sure. What?
That's okay. Go ahead.
Yeah, cybersecurity, I think it's a priority at FERC. It'll be a priority for both Republican and Democratic members. FERC is sort of nonpartisan or bipartisan by temperament. But I think cybersecurity is, the support for cybersecurity is so strong, I think it could lead to FERC taking an approach on transmission investment where FERC could commit itself to securing higher levels of investment for multiple purposes, not just for clean energy grid, because the members might disagree, but for resiliency, reliability, and for cybersecurity defense. But I think you could actually develop I have some ideas on a FERC policy that would increase transmission investment, and you could have a policy that's either time limited or it's revisited after a period of years. So it wouldn't guarantee quote, excessive returns in the perspective of some in perpetuity. It would be, we need to jumpstart, we need to protect our grid from cyber attacks, we need to deliver the new clean energy resources, the best resources, not the worst resources that happen to work around the inadequate grid.
It's getting, we're about 10 minutes over time now. So I want to bring this to an end by asking any of the panelists, are there things that you think we should have talked about, you wanted to say, you didn't get a chance to say, now's the time to say it. So I'm not going to decide on the order. John, you go first.
Well, I think a very important factor is going to be how the new Congress, and especially the Senate, reacts to President-elect Biden's appointments and getting them into place, getting them confirmed, how they approach potentially bipartisan issues. If they list a few saying, look, we're hopelessly divided on these, let's not waste time dealing with them, but here are some major issues where we think a good bipartisan bill should be able to pass and get signed and start making real progress. I think we could make real progress in the first year of the Biden administration.
Phil.
Jim, just a comment about bipartisanship. People sometimes confuse what we mean by that, or they have different meanings. And one is that's where both the leaders of both parties join together and we all, join hands and it's kumbaya and we suddenly get something done. That's very rare and only in a crisis, as we saw earlier this year with a couple of the packages. Most of what we're talking about is, are there just any cross-party coalitions that develop on specific issues? We've mentioned a few like on RPE and other things. And that's what I think my hope is we're going to see a lot more of. That both parties have been, and by the way, there've been a lot of negotiation and bargaining within the Democratic Party on these issues too. I think this is speculative, but one of the phenomenon of having Trump as president is both parties became more tightly wound, either in the necessity to go along with him or the desire to go along with him, or in the opposition to him. And in both parties, I think there are going to be both outside forces and as well as a desire by individual members to have an impact on what's going on and not just go along with the crowd on their political side of the fence. So I don't think we're going back to what some of us thought were the heyday of congressional negotiations across party lines, but I do think it's not going to be just a repeat of what we saw the last 4 years.
Joe, you have the last word.
Yeah, thanks. I mean, I agree with Phil. Part of it is, if you've watched Congress long enough, you have to remember the Congress of the past isn't around anymore. There aren't a lot of Phil Sharps in the House. So something that was like a Bingaman bill was very achievable 10 years ago. Is that same bill achievable now? It should be, but you have so many people who have run for Congress saying, if you elect me, I will never compromise. I always found that odd. How do you put your hand on a Bible and take an oath to uphold the Constitution if you're spitting on the very structure of the Constitution? But so that's a question mark. This Congress hasn't passed much significant legislation for years. And so these are muscles that haven't been used. It's something that should be in the world of the possible, but is it because of the incapacity of Congress? I'm not sure.
If I could
go ahead.
Add one thing to what Joe said is, in some ways, ironically, the incumbents are better prepared to begin acting on this precisely because there have been extensive hearings, because you have in that compilation, 500-page compilation of virtually every possible policy you might adopt that came out of the thing. Now, most members don't pay attention or don't stay on top of that, but there is some staff and some members that are prepared and will be aggressively trying to act. I am not sanguine about how much will get done, but real opportunity is there. They're not going to suddenly start out just saying, oh, gee, what might we do on this? They have a lot of things worked out. They, meaning individuals, have and committees have.
And Jim, just one last comment, environmental policy. Like energy policy we've established is non-partisan or bipartisan. There's many laws you could point to prove that. Environmental policy is partisan, and it's for reasons that make my head explode. To me, it's not inevitable. It is avoidable, but it's partisan for a couple reasons. One is many environmental groups, for reasons I don't fully understand, have decided to become part of the Democratic Party. They're almost equivalent to labor unions. So from a Republican point of view, there aren't many environmental groups that have any kind of outreach or even attempt to develop support among Republicans. So that creates a dynamic where they either get feast or famine. They feast when they have united control of all branches of the US government by Democrats, which is going to happen sometimes, but not that frequently. And I think that's a strategic error. I think there should be one or more environmental groups that seek to develop support in the Republican side. I also think it's equally a blunder by Republicans to scorn environmental issues. If the Republican Party has been slaughtered in the suburbs, at least, well, the president was slaughtered this year, but the congressional candidates were slaughtered 2018. I don't know how you try to rebuild the party's support while scorning any concern for environmental impacts. So I think it's a blunder by both Republicans and environmental groups, and maybe they'll continue to blunder in their opposite directions, but I think it's certainly avoidable, and I will never understand why environmental policy can't be bipartisan or nonpartisan.
And on that hopeful view, which happens to correspond with my head's exploded so long time ago when I think of conserving the environment as not being a conservative cause. Let's turn it back to any final words from Dave Williams as we close out this seminar. But I want to give thanks to all four of the panelists. I, for one, had a remarkably good time and learned a remarkably large amount in a short period of time. So thank you so much, Dave.
And thank you, Jim, for running a really interesting webinar.
Well, and I get to come in on the end and thank you all for just such a wonderful webinar. This is like, we could continue this the rest of the day. Wish we had time, but we don't. And so for those of you that have listened, please let your friends and colleagues know this has been recorded, will be on the association's Rewind page later today. Once again, we thank the Business Committee of the United States Association for Energy Economics, headed by Marie Fagan from London Economics, for sponsoring today's webinar. If you're not a member of the association, we welcome you to join. Visit us at www.usaee.org. Thank you once again, and I officially close this webinar.